The theme, as I've said, is human biodiversity. So when I planned this, I thought to myself, who could I invite to give the most politically incorrect speech possible? Well, the jolly heretic, of course. And he's going to give a speech about how to judge people's character by how they look, by what they look like. And I'm sure you're going to enjoy this. And I think that's all I need to say, so please welcome Ed Dutton.
Hello, and thank you for coming. And I think this has been a superb event, considering. And the food was extremely nice. Now, when I was thinking on the plane about sort of how to begin this speech, as I was at the airport in Helsinki, I noticed that all of the Norwegian airline planes had famous Norwegian people on the tail fin, various people I hadn't heard of. And there's only one Norwegian that most people in Britain have heard of, and that is, of course, the great children's author Roald Dahl. And I thought it was perhaps particularly important to talk about Roald Dahl, being as that I'm an English person here or British person here in Norway, and a lot of you are Norwegian, and he was, of course, ethnically Norwegian, but he was brought up in Britain. He was brought up in Wales. It's as if he was your gift to us, which we've kind of given back, because I was searching around in the back room over there, and I found every single Roald Dahl book there is. In particular, this one is The Witches by Roald Dahl. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the book The Witches. For those of you who are not, those of you who are Danish, for example, and therefore haven't heard of Roald Dahl, The Witches is a book about a Norwegian boy who ends up moving to Britain, and he has a grandmother in Norway, and that grandmother is a witch hunter. That grandmother knows how to identify witches from sight. And that grandmother says that the English witches are the worst witches in the world. They are witches that want to turn little children into mice. They are the most appalling witches that there are. Indeed, it says here that the most important thing you should know about real witches is this. Listen very carefully. Real witches wear ordinary clothes and look very much like ordinary women. They live in ordinary houses and they work ordinary jobs. That's why they're so hard to catch. A real witch spends all her time plotting how to get rid of a nation's children. And in particular, its territory. Her passion is to do away with them, one by one. It is all she thinks about all day long, even if she is working as a cashier in the supermarket or sponging off the Norwegian social security system. Typing letters for a businessman or hanging around a vegan supermarket. Her mind will always be plotting, scheming, churning, burning and whizzing and fizzing with murderous, bloodthirsty thoughts. And I thought this was very, very relevant to what was happening today, and it's very, very relevant to what has happened to us today. Because what Roald Dahl notes in his book is that witches are bad, witches are evil, they are evil both mentally and physically. And he looks at this in his book. Female witches are bald, for example. So you can tell a woman is a witch because she's always scratching her wig, because she's bald underneath. She's physically unattractive. They lack toes, and they're absolutely ghastly when they take off all their makeup. They look absolutely appalling, not unlike some women that were hanging around outside today. And the reason why this works, the reason why it works in fairy tales, the reason why it works in Roald Dahl books, the reason why it works in literature, all the way up into the 19th century, is that it is true. It is true that there is a degree to which you can judge people by what they look like. The body does express, to some degree, internal states. And this truth, I mean, was it Oscar Wilde that said, only shallow people don't judge by appearances? This truth has been successfully suppressed by the left such that we can't talk about it. It has been successfully suppressed by the kind of witches, the kind of evil broomstick freak witches that were screaming at us all day today. And my purpose, as I see it, is to take that truth back. So let us look at who these witches are. Who are witches? Well, there's detailed historical research on the kind of people who were hanged for witchcraft in England in the 16th and 17th centuries, or who were burned for witchcraft in this country and in other parts of Europe. Those people tended to be ugly, childless women. Now, not unlike the screeching harpies who were shouting things in front of us all day today. Ugly, childless women. And I'm not saying that if you are a childless woman, there's a I mean, you can pass on your genes indirectly via group selection. I will look at group selection later. But if you do that, I imagine you'll probably be quite good looking. In general, ugly, childless women. That is who was executed. Now, why was that? What was the problem with these witches? Why did these witches have to go? Well, according to a very interesting paper that was published in the journal Mankind Quarterly, which I edit, or this paper anyway got me thinking about it, there is good reasons for this. Basically, witches challenged that which was evolutionarily adaptive. What was evolutionarily adaptive under conditions of harsh Darwinian selection? Because let's not forget that until relatively recently, until about 1800, we were under conditions of harsh Darwinian selection. Child mortality was 40%, only the healthiest would survive and pass on their genes, and then there was group selection as well. There were different, you could pass on your genes indirectly, through your kin, but also through the extended... What? Do you want the mic closer? Is that a problem?
Your preference.
I'll carry on. Lost my flow now. The extended, can everyone hear me at the back? Good, right. So the extended genotype, which is the ethnic group, and research by Frank Salter, who's a very interesting Australian academic, has shown that there really are these extended genetic genotypes, these clusters. Ethnic groups, in that sense, are a real thing. You are more genetically similar to an average person of your own ethnic group than you are to a random person from another ethnic group. Okay, the difference is very small between Danes and English people, for example, but the difference is still there. Now, so what is it then that you have? You have this, or you had, under Darwinian conditions, this group selection, these different groups which are competing with each other, fighting with each other to pass on their genes. Now, what is it that predicts successful group selection? Well, one of those things is basically being ethnocentric, being positively and negatively ethnocentric. Positively ethnocentric is that you think your group's the best thing in the world and you're prepared to make sacrifices for it, maybe even sacrifice your life for it. And negative ethnocentrism is that you dislike the outgroup and you're prepared to behave lethally to the outgroup when the time comes. This is positive and negative ethnocentrism. Now, and this has been replicated many times, a number of very clever computer types. I've met a number of very clever computer types while I've been here today. I've been talking to them. And a number of these very clever computer types have set up these models where they have shown that if you have different kinds of group, one group in which you always cooperate with the outsider and never with the insider, one group where you don't cooperate with anybody, one group, and so on, one group where you cooperate with everybody, then it is the ethnocentric group, i.e. that you don't cooperate with the outsider but you cooperate with the insider. That group always eventually comes to dominate the grid. The ethnocentric group ultimately survives in the battle of group selection. Now, what is it that predicts ethnocentrism? What is it that makes a group more likely to be ethnocentric, well, and therefore more likely to be group selected? Well, a big part of it is religiousness, is traditional religiousness, a patriarchal religiousness of the kind that we have had in Europe until really relatively recently. Why is this the case? We know religiousness is adaptive, religiousness is about 40% heritable, religiousness is present across all cultures, religiousness is associated with fertility, religiousness is associated with mental health, religiousness is associated with physical health, but religiousness is also associated with ethnocentric attitudes, particularly negative ethnocentric attitudes. And indeed there was an experiment where when they sort of magnetically interfere with a particular part of the brain called the posterior medial frontal cortex, then you become both less ethnocentric and less religious. So it seems that the two things go together. religiousness seems to somehow, or at least traditional religiousness, I'm not talking about the religiousness you have in Sweden where they worship Greta Thunberg and there's a you know, not that, but traditional religiousness would be expected to correlate with the ethnocentrism, and indeed it does. And this makes sense because if you look at most traditional religions, then what they tend to do is take things which are evolutionarily adaptive, such as go forth and multiply, such as whatever, you know, and make those the will of God, such that they're more likely to be adhered to. So it makes sense that religiousness is going to promote ethnocentric behaviour. Another dimension to something that will promote ethnocentric behaviour is patriarchy. If the ladies in the room would forgive me, although all of the ladies in the room are surely good anti-feminists, so I'm sure nobody's going to mind. But it's patriarchy. Now, how does patriarchy work? And this brings me back to this fascinating paper by Montrose, was one of Grant and Montrose, that was in the Mankind Quarterly, where they say, well, under normal conditions, men sexually select for youth and beauty because a man can copulate as many times as he can get away with and as many times as his gentleman products permit him to. And so he wants to have lots and lots of sex with lots and lots of women, preferably young, because then they're fertile, and good looking, because that implies low levels of mutation and the children are going to be healthy and his genes will be passed on. The female has the opposite thing. The female wants to, is more likely to survive if the male will invest in her and invest in her offspring. So she wants investment, and therefore, although of course women are sexually attracted to good-looking men of the kind that there's so many of here today, even so, there is a degree to which they do sexually select more for status, for the status or the ability to achieve it of males. So, once you get a situation where the ecology is quite stable and competitive, and therefore the children are more likely to survive if they are invested in, and then of course the women are selecting for the status of the males, and so you get a situation where the males are investing their resources, and they want to make sure they're not cuckolded, like our speaker in Britain, John Burker. They want to make sure they're not cuckolded. They want to make sure their resources are not, squandered. They want to make sure that the woman doesn't simply steal their resources while stealing the gametes of another, probably younger and more fit man. So how can they achieve this? Well, Grant and Montrose argue that the way that they achieve this is through patriarchy. It's partly through patriarchy. So if you get patriarchy, if you have mate guarding, which is basically the essence of patriarchy, then the man can be more sure that they really are his children. And he can be more sure that his investment hasn't gone to waste. And so it follows that then there will be less fighting between males. There will be less inter-male conflict, because they will be more sure that they're not going to get cuckolded. They'll be more sure that a man is not going to, as it were, I believe the phrase is pump and dump with their wife, and thus be the cuckoo in the nest, and thus mean that they don't really pass on their genes. And so then you get the development of patriarchy. So patriarchy reduces inter-male conflict. If it reduces inter-male conflict, it means these men are cooperating more, and that's what positive ethnocentrism is to a certain degree. It's cooperating with other people from your own group for the broader good. So it elevates ethnocentrism, so religiousness therefore takes patriarchy and makes patriarchy the will of God. It makes complete sense. The society that is more patriarchal up to a certain point is going to be the society that's more successful. Now, the problem is that these witches, they challenge this. They challenge the patriarchy by setting up their own little kind of mini priesthoods, really, where you rather than go to the priest and ask the priest to cure you of whatever ails you, you go to one of these old ladies, or by literally engaging in magic. And in England there was the case of the Pendle witch trials in about 1612, I think it was. And these people really did genuinely practice some form of what they regarded as magic, and they regarded it as real. I mean, it was a placebo effect, as it were, or a nocebo effect. But these people believed in magic, and they practiced it. And in doing that, they were challenging, therefore, the power and the authority and the monopoly of the church. They were challenging the patriarchy, and so they were a problem. That's what these witches, therefore, were. They were a problem, and they had to be gotten rid of. And that's what Grant and Montrose argue happened with witches, and they argue that is why the witch crazes happened. And indeed, they argue that is why the witch crazes happened when they did. If you go into medieval Europe, in early medieval Europe, nobody cared about witchcraft. In England, it wasn't even illegal. that as the selection pressures became harsher, it became colder, the end of the medieval warm period, more pressure, the Black Death, greater selection for intelligence, greater selection also for religiousness, because religiousness is associated with health and whatever, as I said, and also associated with certain personality traits which will be selected for in a harsh ecology, such as cooperativeness, conscientiousness, that kind of thing. Then you get this witch craze, they argue. Then you start to have this problem with witches, because witches are undermining the system that is promoting the good of the group, and the good of the group in a context like that is all that's important. Now, if we look at the data, between 1566 and 1666 in England, 85% of people who were put on trial for witchcraft were women over the age of 50. 40% of those that were put on trial for witchcraft, or say 50%, were spinsters. That is to say, women who had never married. So we're talking women who had never married, who are over the age of 50. Now, in that context, I mean, from the sexual selection issues that I discussed earlier, what kind of women are these going to be? These are going to be the ancestors, in terms of physiognomy, the precursors of the kind of screaming bitches that were out there earlier today. And I think that is quite obvious to all of us. And I'm not saying that those people should be put on trial for witchcraft and burned at the stake, as happened in early modern Norway, but it's just putting it out there. Now, a very interesting discussion of this whole issue was produced by David Pickering in his Dictionary of Witchcraft, and he gets contemporary descriptions of what these women were like. He quotes things such as, they were spinsters, over 50, with odd ways, squints, eyebrows that joined in the middle, or a generally unattractive appearance. And these were the kind of women that found themselves on trial for, and indeed burned for, witchcraft. The kind of women, basically, women who had what we call in, what those biologists call, a high level of mutational load, which would be expected. Maladaptations of the body would be expected to correlate with maladaptations of the mind, being ugly inside and ugly outside. Now, this brings me on then, in terms of theoretically understanding this, to some of you may be familiar with my very conformist and normie colleague, Michael Woodley of Manee, with whom I do videos on the Jolly Heretic, and his theory of the spiteful mutants, the social epistasis model. Now, what he argues is this. Until the Industrial Revolution, as I said earlier, we were under these intense conditions of Darwinian selection, 40% child mortality every single generation, every single generation, and therefore these people that had poor immune systems, let's say, would never have reached adulthood. They would never have passed on their genes. Now, with the introduction of the Industrial Revolution, you then get a complete collapse in this, from 40% child mortality in 1800 to about 1% child mortality today. Now, what that means is you are getting this build-up of spiteful mutations. You are getting these spiteful mutants that would have been purged from the population with their poor immune systems and whatever, every generation with their autism, with their whatever, but these spiteful who would have been purged from the population every generation. And mutations, one of the markers of mutation, of course, is having an ugly face, having a maladaptive face, because if you have a good immune system, then you can fight off, you can maintain a symmetrical phenotype, and you can fight off all the pathogens and whatever, and you can maintain a symmetrical phenotype. If you have a poor immune system, then you will spend proportionately more of your bioenergetic resources fighting off these diseases, and you will end up with an ugly, maladaptive face. So, and indeed, there is data that Michael has published which shows that our faces are literally becoming more asymmetrical across time since the 19th century. We are becoming uglier, genetically uglier across time, which is consistent with the build-up of these mutations. Anyway, these are, of course, mutations of the body, but the point is that the brain is about, according to Michael's paper, about 84% of the genome. Now, this means that it is a massive target for mutation. Most of the mutation that's going to occur is going to occur on the brain. And so it follows that if you have mutations of the body, then you will definitely have mutations of the brain. I mean, that almost certainly goes without saying. And so consequently, as these mutations of the body have built up, as we've got more and more of these ugly women of the kind that you saw outside, well, some of them were quite pretty, but perhaps they had very bad mutations of the mind, and therefore it was all focused there. But anyway, then you will get these, what Michael calls these spiteful mutants. And these spiteful mutants will rise to the top of society and will advocate literally maladaptive things. They will advocate things which, under conditions of Darwinian selection, would have got any group that had even a small percentage of them advocating such things destroyed, killed, wiped out. Maladaptive behaviour, such as, an example that I looked at was atheism. Now, if something is maladaptive, it means that, basically in medical terms, it means that it prevents you fertility, it interferes with fertility. So I looked at this atheism in a paper I did called The Mutant Says in His Heart There Is No God. And we looked at these various correlates, various examples of mutation, various correlates for mutation, and we found that, yes, people who are atheists are more likely to be physically ill than Christians, the religious people, more likely to be mentally ill than religious people, less likely to have children than religious people, more likely to be autistic than religious people, which is also associated with not having children, and is a sign of mutation, and is the older a father is, the more likely he is to have an autistic son, because of the greater likelihood of maladaptive sperm. So therefore, atheism would be an example of something which undermines ethnocentrism, it undermines religiousness, it therefore undermines ethnocentrism, it undermines group selection, it destroys society. And indeed, there was research on being right-wing, actually. Now, right-wing, there's one scale of fundamentalism that correlates with the scale of being right-wing at about 0.75 or something. So there's a degree to which being right-wing and being Christian or being fundamentalist is the same thing. It was a study by, I think it was someone called Berggren. I think he was a Swedish researcher. And they found that people who are right-wing have objectively more symmetrical faces than people who are left-wing. And then there was another study which found that people who are right-wing are rated, just their faces this is, as more physically attractive than people who are left-wing. Now this makes sense, of course, because people who are right-wing and who are religious are on the whole taking the idea that we were adapted for under hundreds of years of Darwinian selection, i.e. we are adapted to be ethnocentric, we are adapted to collectively worship a moral god or gods, we are adapted to these things, and they are still holding to those ways of thinking. So we would expect those people to have lower levels of mutational load, and this would be expressed in them having lower levels of mutational load in the face, and this would be expressed in them being better looking. And this is why I've met women today who have told me that they're middle-aged or whatever and menopausal and look about 35. Because they would expect people like that to be in a room like this, because there is a degree to which we are the remnant normal population who would have survived under Darwinian conditions, and the people out there today are mutants. Mutants. Subhuman mutants. Witches. Witches who literally want to destroy children. Now, so this another example, of course, would be something like feminism. I mean, what is more physically ghastly than a feminist? And feminists tend, feminism, of course, what's it saying? It's saying if you are a good mother or whatever, and that's all you are, then you're a loser and you're pathetic and so on. That's feminism. Then you've got this extinction rebellion we have in the UK. It's basically, it wants human extinction, basically. It's saying we should limit the population and we should go back to a sort of a dark age. Now, these could all be regarded as being caused by these mutants. And the tendency is that with the introduction of the Industrial Revolution and so on, better medicine, all this, that this change started among the middle class and the upper class. It was those people who experienced the benefits of industrialization first. If you like, it was those at the top of society who have been under Darwinian selection for the least time. So we would expect them to be more mutated than those at the bottom of society, who interestingly tend to, A, for environmental reasons, it's more stressful or whatever, the higher mortality salience, and this makes you more religious. Religion is associated with stress. But B, they would be more maladaptive. Now, Gregory Clark, who I think someone mentioned earlier, you in your speech mentioned Gregory Clark earlier, Gregory Clark, in his book, The Sun Also Rises, found that the heritability of socioeconomic status across time in a number of European countries, including Britain, Denmark, Sweden, across time between the medieval period and 1950 was 0.7. So there's a degree to which these social classes are social castes. So you would expect, therefore, the mutants to end up in positions of power, because that's where they'd start. So they get into these positions of power, and then, of course, this is the second part of Woodley and his theory, is that they can influence even the non-carriers to do maladaptive things. Because humans are extremely environmentally plastic, we are very, very adapted to very specific niches, this kind of thing. And so it means that, unlike a cat simply has an instinct to clean itself or whatever, humans have to learn these things. We're very environmentally plastic. And so if our environment is interfered with, then of course the consequences can be disastrous. We simply won't learn adaptive things, and this will have a terrible impact on us. And this is what is seemingly happened with these spiteful mutants. They get into positions of power, and they undermine important institutions within the society that have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to be adaptive, such as the religion, such as the education system, and whatever. And they undermine that, such that even the non-carriers are inculcated with their sick, self-destructive, anti-nationalistic, anti-human, just anti-life ideology, and thus act to destroy themselves. Now, somebody commented to me earlier that some of the girls that were campaigning out there weren't that bad. I mean, they weren't, I think it was Kevin that was saying to me that they weren't a 10, but they were maybe a 6. But they weren't that bad. Now, this would make sense, of course, because women are more cooperative than men, women are higher in conscientiousness and rule following and empathy and whatever, and so therefore you can see how they can be dragged into these groups more easily than perhaps men can, who would be less agreeable and more sceptical of this kind of stuff, and therefore they can be inculcated to behave maladaptively. And this is, of course, what's happening. And feminism is a good example of this. So we have an ideology which says to women that if you are a traditional woman, then you're a loser and you're pathetic and you're evil and you're bad. And so consequently, they spend all of their 20s, and increasingly even the first half of their 30s, dedicated to their careers, at least the more intelligent ones do. And then by the time they have one or two children, or maybe they find they've left it too late, they don't have any at all. So they've literally damaged their genetic prospects, whereas the less intelligent women, they start having sex at 15 or whatever, they're pregnant by 16, they're a grandmother at 40. And so those women are passing on their genes, and the more intelligent women are not doing so. And consequently, there is a negative correlation, -0.1, between intelligence and fertility now in the West. And this means that intelligence, which is about 0.8 heritable, is going down. And we know from research from Iceland that the percentage of the population carrying alleles, which are associated with very high educational attainment, and thus with very high IQ, has decreased over the last 3 generations. So this is maladaptive in terms of intelligence. It's causing our IQ to go down, but it's also causing people to not have children. Or not have many. Another example of maladaptive behaviour that these spiteful mutants promote is, of course, atheism. Atheism is associated with limiting your fertility, not having many children, that kind of thing. So atheism is another one. Another one they promote, worst of all perhaps, is multiculturalism. So multiculturalism is associated with clearly damaging your genetic interests, because you are letting into the country lots and lots of people who are genetically very different from you. And the more genetically different they are from you, the more it is damaging your genetic interests. And one thing I was told, I have been in Oslo since 2002, and I was told, well, the change you're going to notice is there's 300% more Somalis here than there were in 2002. And I have noticed that. Some of them become policemen. These are people, I mean, the genetic difference between Africans and non-Africans is huge. And so, of course, it means that this is damaging the genetic interests. I'm now waiting, God, are they going to drag me out and take me to prison? I mean, God, I don't want to say that. So this is a very, very damaging thing. And then even more damaging than that, of course, is the environmentalist Greta Thunberg types that want to basically make humanity go extinct. And so humanity as a whole is somehow bad. So these are all maladaptive ideologies. Now, This is not the first. A frightening example of this can be seen in a very interesting experiment which kind of inspired Woodley's paper called Mouse Utopia, which was conducted in the late 60s, early 70s. And it very eerily, remember, they want to turn us into mice. It's very relevant to this, because we are doing what the mice did in this experiment. They got these mice and they basically took away Darwinian conditions, essentially. They took away predation, they took away all kinds of other things that would be a problem. They created a mouse utopia. Now, what happened at first was a massive spike in population. Just like happened to us with the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly people aren't dying of childhood diseases or whatever anymore, so you've got a massive spike in population. Secondly, then, they notice the population starts to slow down. The spike starts to slow down. And then it starts to sort of plateau. Well, we're beyond that now, but it starts to plateau, and then it starts to fall. And as that's happening, they're noticing interesting things. They're noticing that the females are becoming more kind of aggressive and male-like, and are throwing the young out of the nest too early, so they don't learn proper social skills, and they don't know how to deal with other mice. And you start to get the females are having to pester the males for sex, rather like in modern-day Japan. And then there's a growing caste of males, known as the beautiful ones, who are effeminate, autistic weirdos, who aren't interested in sex at all, and just stand there all day going, Nazi mice off our streets, Nazi mice off our streets. And eventually, and all they do is preen each other and drink water and wash each other, and eventually all of the mice are either beautiful ones, butch females are interested in men, or just these non-socialised oddballs that don't know how to do basic mouse behaviour. And within about 4 years or 3 years of setting up the experiment, all the mice had died. And you can see how this very precisely parallels the situation that we're in. And it very, very, very precisely parallels the situation that Japan is in, where the population is no immigration, so the population is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. That is the situation. So you can see, therefore, that ugliness on the outside parallels ugliness on the inside. This whole situation has serious consequences, and we can see why this is happening. They are trying to take away from us an adaptive, these mutants, they are trying to destroy us by taking away an adaptive way of understanding the world. They are trying to take away from us the ability to act on what we see with our own eyes. To the extent that we can't say that a man who is a man and identifies as a woman is a man. And then even when he goes to prison for rape and then decides to be a woman so he can go to a woman's prison, he's still a woman. And even when he's literally raping women in the woman's prison, where he's been sent because he's a woman, he's still a woman. We literally can't act on what we can see with our own eyes. Now that is, I mean, my colleague Bruce Charlton, who I interviewed on my channel the other night, he said that's demonic. It's demonic. And it is demonic in the sense that religiousness takes that which is adaptive and it makes it the will of God. This is taking things which are maladaptive, literally maladaptive, and making them the will of some kind of God, some kind of evil God, who these people seem to worship every morning. And so there are many examples of this, and I want to look at a few examples of them today. Now, one of the things you may notice about Roald Dahl is, of course, he is bald. He is a bald man. And there are many bald people in the world. And many of those bald people are evil. Think of Hellraiser. Think of Dr. Robotnik. Think of the former Swedish Prime Minister, Reinfeldt, attempting to destroy your country with Syrians. Evil, bald men. But then at the same time, there are so many bald men who are kind of geniuses, really. People like James Watson. People like Charles Darwin. They're bald. And not only are they bald, they go bald young. And I see men there fiddling with their hair and sort of wishing. But now, why would this be the case? To what extent does baldness tell you something about what a person would be like internally? Well, it's an interesting thing. Baldness is correlated with testosterone to some extent. So if you are bald, there's other things involved as well, but it is correlated with testosterone. And so people going for male pattern baldness can be inherited, but there is a testosterone sort of element to it. And this means that testosterone is associated with a certain kind of personality, a certain essentially masculinized personality, relatively low in what we call agreeableness, relatively low in conscientiousness or impulse control, having a great deal of drive and status seeking and this kind of thing. This is testosterone. So, of course, if a person has, well, you can't just take one marker of testosterone and say, okay, that person's going to be careful, don't piss him off. But if they've got a number of markers of testosterone and they all go in the same direction, baldness is one, another is 2D/4D ratio, which is the difference in this finger and this finger, another is mid-pelagial hair, which is if you've got hair here on the finger. There's various markers of testosterone, and if a person has all of them, then what you would predict is they would have high testosterone, and this would be reflected in their character. This would be reflected in how they behaved. Now, this is a perfectly adaptive thing in life, to know these kinds of things and to behave accordingly. And it's something you've seen in all literature, all old literature, Chaucer or whatever, that you should judge people by what they look like, and baldness is one example of this. Now, this brings me on to these positive bald people. What is genius? What is genius? Well, genius seems to be a combination of outlier high intelligence and basically bloody antisocial personality. That is genius. And that can be reduced to a certain extent to outlier high intelligence plus optimally high testosterone. Now, myself and my two colleagues, Guy Madison and Dimitri van der Linden, we tested this in a paper we did on this, and we took Science Nobel Prizes per capita as a marker of genius, and we took important scientific publications per capita as a marker of genius, and then we took a number of markers of testosterone for which there was national level data available, such as mid-pelagial hair, such as 2D/4D ratio, and a number of sexual partners, and a number of others. And we found that if you control for IQ, well, not control for it, but if you look at only countries that have an IQ of at least 90, then testosterone level does predict per capita genius. And this makes, of course, perfect sense, because what it is that's predicting genius is intelligence, and there's a degree to which you're kind of controlling for that, not controlling, but you're kind of, and testosterone. So once you look at countries with only an IQ above 90, testosterone starts to hit in as the important thing. And then we tried to replicate it by using other testosterone markers. One testosterone marker is left-handedness. People who are left-handed are, in general, higher in testosterone. So we collected, in another paper by myself, Guy and Dimitri, national level left-handedness data, and we correlated this with national level science Nobel Prizes and scientific publications, and we found a correlation of about 0.6 between per capita left-handedness, when you can, with IQ above 90, left-handedness, and basically genius. So what we're seeing is that these people are, these geniuses, these high testosterone people, more like left-handed. Testosterone is the factor here. So this, of course, makes sense, that you can therefore judge people by what they look like. Some people in this room may be the evil bald people, and some I've met so far, I think, actually, may be the genius bald people. But one way or the other, it is highly relevant. Why should these things be the case among animals, but not among us? Why should there be some rule that there's these biological differences among all creatures that relate to the mind and to the body, but not us? Suddenly it stops with us. Well, of course it doesn't. And this is an example of it. So that's men. So much for men. Let's look at another interesting correlation: personality and boob size. Now, personality and the size of your breasts. Now, there is evidence of a clear relationship here. Now, study, I cite the study in my book, How to Judge People What They Look Like, found that women who have larger breasts tend to be lower in agreeableness and lower in conscientiousness than women who have smaller breasts. And women who have larger breasts also tend to be more sociosexual. So, that is to say, more promiscuous. So if you're looking for a fun night out, then you need to go for those big shirt potatoes. But if you're looking for commitment, then it's the fried eggs. Now, what is the what is the theoretical basis behind this? Well, one thing that it could be reduced to is life history theory. The idea with life history theory is if you are in an unstable yet easy environment, if you're unstable, you can be wiped out at any minute, you're going to live fast and die young, so therefore you have to advertise your genetic quality, and you have to advertise it quickly. How can you advertise your genetic quality and advertise it quickly? You can put energy into large secondary sexual characteristics, hence large breasts and large buttocks, and you see this at its most extreme, of course, among women who are from sub-Saharan Africa, where you have these features, and most extreme of all, of course, is among the Bushmen. The Bushman race of southern Africa, where not only do they have large breasts, they have extremely large buttocks, to the extent that their children can stand on them. and they have a labia that hangs down 6 inches between their legs, which adheres together like a banana skin. I don't know why you're laughing, it's all scientific stuff and completely true. Anyway, so take it seriously, let's raise the level here. Now, so this makes complete sense, they would do that. Now, once the ecology starts to become more stable and more harsh, then there is greater selection for psychological trait, and the female wants investment, the male wants evidence he's not going to be cuckolded, so you have greater selection for psychological traits. More energy has to be put into the brain, more energy has to be put into intelligence, into a more complex brain, into agreeableness and whatever, and therefore less energy is going to be put into large secondary sexual characteristics. And so consequently the sexual characteristics will get smaller, and not only that, but these secondary sexual characteristics will tell you that the woman is likely to be higher in agreeableness and higher in conscientiousness. And in that ecology, where you don't want to get cuckolded, then of course you should be attracted to those. And indeed it has been found that men who are higher in agreeableness and conscientiousness are themselves attracted to smaller breasts. So it all makes sense. So there is a degree to which you can judge men by what they look like and women by what they look like on those traits. Another example is the face. There is a strong degree to which you can judge. There's a lot of research going on this in China. That you can, the associations between IQ and the nature of the face. People who have low IQ tend to have small eyes, small noses, basically looking a bit like someone that has Down syndrome. Now, that makes a great deal of sense, of course, because Down syndrome, people who have Down syndrome have very low intelligence indeed. And because something has gone wrong in development, they have an extra chromosome and so on. And so therefore they have these features in a pronounced way. So it follows that if you have those features within the normal range, then why wouldn't it make sense that if you have those features, you'd be more likely to be less intelligent? Or that something would have gone wrong in development. And therefore, the problem with your mind would be reflected with the abnormal nature of your face. Now, this brings me on to Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg, as you may have noticed, is severely autistic to the extent that she has had selective mutism, to the extent that she's being exploited by the kind of people that were out there today, and it's very, very sad. And I think we should all have sympathy for her, and I look forward to the day when she is allowed to, when she comes to her senses and comes and speaks at a Scandza forum 10 years hence. But you can certainly see, and I've spoken to friends of mine who are doctors about this, and it was them that put the idea in my head, really, that she may well have partial fetal alcohol syndrome. And this would be consistent with the autism, it would be consistent with the fact that there's no severe damage in terms of intelligence, it would be consistent with the nature of the eyes, which are these epicanthic eye folds, it would be consistent with the small nose, and it would be consistent with the lack of a fulcrum. She doesn't. This is a marker of fetal alcohol syndrome. So basically, this is another way in which you can judge people by what they look like. And there are many others. Now, it should be emphasized that these are small correlations. And you, of course, can't simply take one marker, such as baldness, or having a manly face shape, or having girly fingers, or being left-handed, or whatever, and start making judgments. That would be stupid. And that would be the kind of thing that if a leftist biased journalist was here watching this, they'd try and say I was trying to argue. That's not what the point is at all. The point is that if a number of markers, and this is true of any scientific, if a number of markers go in the same direction, then this is likely to mean that a reasonable theory is that something is the case. And this is the case with these examples of physiognomy, and there are many others you could look at, the nature of the body, the colour of the hair. There's loads and loads of things like this. They all can indicate the same thing, that you can indeed judge people by what they look like. And it's just one example of many ways in which the Victorians were right. People go on, they say at the moment, oh, the Muslims are right about women, it's the current meme. Well, the Victorians were right about just about everything. At least when it relates to non-politically correct science today. The Victorians had it right, which makes sense because they had a much higher IQ than us, because we reached our peak about 1800 maybe, and we reached another 1870 in terms of development, in terms of per capita genius. And so it makes sense that the Victorians would be right about this. Physiognomy is something real, physiognomy is something genuine, and anyone that tells you that's not the case, I'm afraid may well be a spiteful mutant. But to be fair, if physiognomy is correct, you probably would already have realised that anyway. Now, what? Yes. So the point I want to finish on by saying is this. Basically, it has to be understood, physiognomy was the norm. And what we are, and it's an extraordinary situation to think, that we are in here today advocating things which were the norm, the absolute norm, as recently as 70 or 80 years ago. And it's evidence of the social epistasis, of the extent to which normal society has collapsed, of the extent of clown world, of the extent of this madness, that we had to have a meeting where we're advocating freedom of speech, where we're advocating freedom of scientific inquiry, where we're advocating free debate, and where we're advocating going in the direction of the scientific evidence. And we have to have this in secret, and that one of the people that wants to say it has to be deported from the country before he's even had the chance to say any of. That is the insanity of the situation that we are in. And the reason we are in that situation is simple. We have a society that is dominated by witches. And these are... We have a society that is dominated by witches. A few hundred years ago, those witches would have been burned, those witches would have been hanged, those witches would have been thrown into the pond, those witches would have been whatever, but now those witches, whether male or female, have been allowed to reproduce, and their children have reproduced, and their grandchildren have reproduced, and their great-grandchildren have reproduced, to the point where we have that coven that's been standing outside for most of today, casting their spells over the minds of the people of Oslo. But the good news is, it's not going to be like that forever. It's not going to be like that. Yes, okay, yes, good. It's not going to be like that forever. And it's not going to be like that forever for a number of reasons. First of all, as I said, intelligence is going down. Because intelligence is going down, per capita innovation is going down. Based on current trends, we are 1/3 of peak. The peak of our per capita genius was 1870, 16 innovations per 10 million of population per year. Now we're down to 4. That means we are down to the level that we were in 1600, when Elizabeth I was on the throne. And we are going to continue going down. 100 years hence, we'll be down to the level that we were in 1000, i.e. the Dark Ages. Now, what that's going to result in, I'm afraid, is a massive collapse. Things will go backwards. The hospitals will stop working. People will not be able to get their medicine. And clearly, the people that will survive that will be the people who were genetically normal, the people that were the religious people, the people that were the conservative people, the people that were the nationalistic people. Basically, the survivors will be people like us. So this is the first reason to have what I believe is known among the young people as a white pill. These people, these mutants, these atheist nutters, and these liberals, and these left-wing people. What predicts breeding is, well, apart from stupidity, obviously, is religiousness and conservatism. That's who breeds. And so, therefore, those genes in the population will go up. What is suppressing the religiousness at the environmental level is, of course, stress and mortality salience. But those things are obviously going to go up as IQ goes down. And so, therefore, the consequence will have to be that these witches will not be here forever. They don't breed. There will be a collapse, and there will come a day, 100 years from now, but it may be a while from now, but it's going to happen, where these witches will be purged from Oslo. These witches will be purged from Norway. We know who they are. And there will come a day in the not too distant future, I assure you, where they will quack no more.